Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take sources, be they historical records, deep research, or biblical essays, and really try to extract the profound insights that are waiting just beneath the surface.
Our goal is always to provide that shortcut to being, thoroughly informed.
And to move past just the surface details to find the truth that anchors us. Today, we're embarking on a journey into the Old Testament. We're going to be studying a kingdom that, I think for many of us, is often overlooked in the grand narrative of Israel.
The Zobahites.
Exactly, the Zobahites. They appear as this powerful, ancient Aramean kingdom whose history is woven pretty deeply into the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon.
And you're right, their presence in Scripture might seem brief.
It does.
But their story, when you slow down and look at it, provides a remarkably profound lesson on the unavoidable intersection of human geopolitics and God's unchanging purpose.
That's a great way to put it.
When you really stop and examine the narrative of Zoba, you realize you're not just reading ancient history, you are witnessing the very mechanisms of theology in action.
How God actively governs the affairs of nations.
Precisely. The goal of this deep dive is to move beyond a mere historical summary and to enter into what we might call worshipful realism.
That's a fascinating phrase. What do you mean by that? By worshipful realism?
It means we're looking at real, measurable, physical history. Borders shifting, wars being fought, economies rising and falling.
All the stuff you'd read in a history book.
All of that. But we're seeing these events not as random chaos, but as the active arena of God's faithfulness. We're studying history through the lens of Daniel, understanding that the Lord removes kings and sets up kings.
So the rise and fall of this one kingdom, Zoba, is actually a case study in that truth.
A perfect case study.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we look at the Zoba narrative, it really does present two stories running in parallel, doesn't it?
It does.
First, you have the immediate, the palpable drama of it all, the fleeting, temporary nature of immense earthly power, a kingdom that rises, threatens Israel, and then
just dissolves.
Right. But simultaneous to that earthly drama is the second, more eternal story.
The steady, relentless unfolding of God's covenant promises. Specifically, those unconditional promises he made to David for an eternal house and kingdom, right there in 2 Samuel 7.
So Zoba's fate is inextricably linked to the success of that covenant.
It has to be.
Which means the Zobahites, this ancient kingdom, they force the thoughtful believer today to confront a very basic, almost existential question. Where should our ultimate confidence and trust lie?
Exactly. And the Bible gives us the answer over and over again, maybe nowhere more clearly than in Psalm 20.
Some trust in chariots and some in horses.
But we trust in the name of the Lord our God. The ancient world, and Zoba is the perfect representative here, they trusted in chariots and horses. And the visible, the quantifiable, the expensive apparatus of war.
And the people of God are called to something different.
To trust only in the name of the Lord. And that's how we want to approach this material calmly, clearly, giving you the theological clarity the biblical writers intended.
I think that sets the serious and warm tone perfectly. So let's begin our deep dive. Let's start by defining this major northern threat. Let's establish the historical and cultural background. Who were the Zobahites, and why was their power such a crucial problem for early Israel? The sources place Zoba geographically as a key player in the Aramean world. They were one of the primary Aramean polities situated directly to Israel's north.
Right, near city-states that would later gain a lot of prominence, like Damascus and Hamath. You see them mentioned together early on.
But this was not some, provincial village, was it?
Oh, far from it. Zoba was a regional superpower. To understand their importance, we really have to look at their strategic reach.
Their influence.
Exactly. The texts imply an influence that was, staggering for a power located in modern-day Syria.
You're referring to that detail in 2 Samuel chapter 8, which says King Hadadezer had gone to restore his control at the Euphrates River when David encountered him.
Precisely. That one single line, it transformed Zoba from just a local neighbor into, an empire.
An empire.
I think so. The Euphrates River was the boundary of the known world for many in the Levant. It was the gateway to Mesopotamia, to Babylon, and Assyria.
So for Hadadezer to be moving to restore his control there.
It suggests that Zoba's traditional sphere of influence stretched far to the northeast. They were controlling crucial routes toward the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. They weren't just a local power. They were competing with the great powers of the day.
And controlling that kind of territory, especially those northern routes, that must have completely defined their wealth. We're talking about a massive economic advantage.
Immense.
Yeah.
Absolutely immense. Their northern position placed Zobah squarely at the commercial crossroads of the ancient Near East.
The main highway, so to speak.
It was. Just think of the flow of high-value goods. Lumber, metals, spices, exotic materials moving between the mighty powers of Mesopotamia, the ports on the Levantine coast like Tyre and Sidon, and then all the wealth of Egypt to the south.
So if you're a trader moving north-south or east-west, you were probably paying tolls, taxes, or some kind of tribute to Zoba.
Exactly. Control of those choke points translated directly into significant measurable wealth. And that wealth bought military resources and, of course, immense diplomatic leverage.
So when we read later about the vast amounts of silver and gold and bronze that David seized from them.
We have to understand that this wasn't just the king's personal savings account.
Oh.
It was the concentrated wealth of a sophisticated, dominant regional economy. Zoba wasn't just a physical threat. It was a major economic and strategic rival that inherently limited Israel's own growth and regional influence.
Which naturally brings us to their military profile. The sources highlight this with great specificity. What markers do the texts give us that really define Zoba's power?
The clearest markers are the assets the biblical writers explicitly focus on.
Okay.
The emphasis on Zoba's chariots and cavalry, you see it in 2 Samuel 8. And this is a crucial detail because in the ancient Near East, having a large, well-equipped chariot corps was the ultimate indicator of superpower status.
Why chariots specifically? What made them so important?
Well, because they represented the absolute pinnacle of technological and economic investment at the time.
So they were expensive.
Phenomenally expensive. You needed highly advanced metallurgy for the axle fittings and the wheel rims. You needed specialized joinery for the lightweight, flexible wooden chassis.
And that's not even mentioning the logistics.
The logistics were staggering, training the horses, providing fodder, managing all the specialized personnel drivers, archers, maintenance crews. It wasn't just equipment, it was an entire high-status military ecosystem. And Zoba had it. They possessed this status, and they relied on it heavily.
And here is where the philosophical and theological tension truly begins. Because the biblical narrative makes a point of highlighting this impressive reliance.
Only to immediately contrast it with God's ultimate sovereignty.
Exactly. It's a deliberate and pointed contrast. The sources cite Psalm 33. The author wants the reader to hold Zoba's chariots in one hand and this theological truth in the other.
No king is saved by the size of his army.
A horse is a vain hope for deliverance. Despite all its great strength, it cannot save.
And that immediately clues the informed reader in. Zoba's reliance on their military apparatus, however technologically superior it was, is completely irrelevant when set against the Lord's purposes.
They trusted in the visible, the tangible, the expensive systems.
And the Bible is signaling right from the start that this trust is misplaced.
Now, beyond their military might, let's briefly touch on their culture. The sources note Zoba was part of the wider Northwest Semitic world, eventually speaking Aramaic, which would much later become the language of regional communication.
Yes, which also implies a degree of cultural sophistication and integration.
And their religious environment.
It was standard for the region.
Yeah.
Aggressive polytheism. We're talking about the worship of powerful regional deities like Hadad, who was often the storm and war god.
And Astarte or Ishtar.
The goddess of love and war. These were powerful, often fierce deities that were associated with military success and national fertility.
And Hadadezer, the king of Zoba himself, he has a name that invokes his gods.
It's a wonderful, specific detail to note. His name essentially means Hadad is help.
So he is literally placing his national trust in that pagan framework. His very identity is wrapped up in it.
It is, and yet the biblical narrative consistently frames this worship as profoundly empty, as impotent. We're reminded that the Lord makes the nations tremble and exposes the emptiness of their gods.
And the prophet Isaiah is later quite sharp about the absurdity of trusting in something man-made.
Isaiah 46 captures that perfectly. It challenges the belief that an idol made of wood and metal, an idol that has to be carried by men, can somehow save or deliver anyone.
So the contest between Israel and Zoba, it wasn't just a skirmish over trade routes.
Not at all. It was a cosmic theological battle between the living sovereign God of the covenant and the gods of the Aramean world.
So to summarize this first section, Zoba is the perfect foil. They're wealthy, they're militarily elite, strategically dominant, and their entire identity is rooted in trusting in visible systems, chariots, wealth, their pagan pantheon.
Which means their subsequent conflict with Israel is therefore inevitable. Not just politically, but theologically.
And their subjugation is presented as this crucial case study in the limits of human power when it presumes to contest God's covenant program.
The program that promises blessing to those who bless Israel and cursing to those who oppose it.
So we've established the scope of the threat. Now we can trace the arc of the conflict itself across 3 reigns: Saul, David, and Solomon.
The story of Zoba provides a perfect mirror, really, for the rise and decline of Israel's early monarchy.
So let's start the arc with that tentative beginning under Saul.
Zoba is introduced right at the start of the monarchy narrative, which establishes its importance as a persistent threat. 1 Samuel 14 is a crucial text here.
It gives us that summary of Saul's early reign.
Yes. After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side: Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines.
That's an all-star lineup of antagonists, isn't it? Listing Zobah right alongside the Edomites and the constantly menacing Philistines. That immediately elevates their status.
It does. It signals that Zobah was not a minor passing threat. It was a major, consistent challenge on Israel's northern perimeter.
And Saul, as the first king, was struggling intensely just to unite the fragmented Israelite tribes and establish a stable, centralized government.
Absolutely. He was constantly diverting resources and attention just to maintain the borders against the pressure from Zobah.
Which tells us something important about the limitations of Saul's kingdom, then.
It does. His rule was characterized by defense, by containment, by perpetual struggle. He never achieved the kind of regional dominance that David would later secure.
He's just holding the line.
Precisely. Saul represents the initial stage of the monarchy. It's one characterized by reliance on human strength, mixed with, intermittent obedience. He could hold the line, but he couldn't conquer and secure the full covenant boundaries. Zobah remained a persistent thorn, demanding constant, draining vigilance.
Then, the moment the reign shifts to David, the whole narrative tone changes entirely.
Completely. The struggle for containment transforms into decisive conquest.
And that watershed moment is found in 2 Samuel 8, where David's incredible string of victories is chronicled. But the military action is constantly framed by that powerful theological refrain.
The Lord gave David victory wherever he went.
That phrase is like a hammer blow, isn't it? Struck by the biblical writer to ensure the reader understands the theological center of gravity.
It is. It prevents us from attributing David's success to superior generalship or better intelligence or just a lucky roll of the dice. It makes it crystal clear. God is actively fulfilling his covenant promise through David.
Let's focus on the campaign against Zobah. David defeats Hadadezer. He secures vast resources. But the most crucial detail, the spiritual statement that really defines the theology of David's kingship, is what he does immediately after seizing the enemy's prized assets.
Yes, the handling of the captured chariot horses. The account states that David hamstrung most of them. He reserved only 100.
This is a physical public action that acts out the theology of the law.
It is.
But wait, if the goal was regional dominance and securing Israel's borders, wouldn't keeping those thousands of captured chariots have been the more prudent political and military move?
That's an excellent, sincere question.
I mean, he would have immediately become the strongest military power in the Levant. Was David risking future security by acting on this faith principle?
And that question gets right to the heart of covenantal trust versus worldly pragmatism. From a purely military standpoint, you are absolutely right. It seems strategically reckless.
He gave up a huge advantage.
He gave up potentially the greatest military advantage of his era. But David was operating from a higher principle, one that was codified in the Mosaic Law.
Deuteronomy 17.
Deuteronomy 17 specifically warned the king of Israel he must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself. And why? Not because horses are inherently evil,
No.
but because multiplying horses represented the ultimate temptation, trusting in military systems and quantifiable might over the invisible God of Israel.
So by hamstringing those horses, by cutting the tendon in the leg, effectively rendering them useless for warfare, David was making an irreversible economic and military statement.
He wasn't just crippling Zobah's apparatus. He was publicly refusing to put his ultimate faith in military hardware. He was declaring Israel's national reliance on God alone.
A declaration of national faith.
It was. Echoing Psalm 20 in physical action, David was essentially saying, we will rely on God, not on the very equipment that symbolized the arrogance and the false security of the nations we just defeated. It establishes this pattern of worshipful dependence that stands in stark contrast to the way the Zobahites operated.
And the immediate geopolitical impact was massive, too. Zobah wasn't isolated.
No. When Arameans from Damascus intervened to try and help Hadadezer, David struck them down as well. He placed garrisons and brought Aram Damascus under tribute. This one victory effectively subdued a vast northern coalition, cementing Israel as the new regional hegemon.
And this leads us directly to the second great theological statement David made.
The consecration of spoils.
He didn't keep the gold, the silver, the bronze plunder seized from Hadadezer's cities for himself.
No, he dedicated it entirely to the Lord.
This act of dedication, coming immediately after the victory, is essential for theological clarity.
It safeguards the theological center. David acknowledges that the victory was God's, and therefore the considerable material fruits of that victory must also belong to God.
So this massive wealth, the gold from Hadadezer's quivers, the bronze from the cities of Tibhath and Kun, it becomes consecrated sanctuary wealth.
Yes, earmarked for the building of the future temple. The wealth of the defeated idolaters is transformed into the resources for the worship of the one true God.
That prevents the victory from breeding pride or self-reliance. It ensures David's heart remains focused on the covenant rather than slipping into the arrogance that defines Zobah.
But the conflict is not entirely over, however.
No.
The spirit of resistance in the Aramean world, it flares up again. This time in collaboration with Israel's southern enemies, the Ammonites. This is Zobah's final stand, now as a mercenary force.
And the scale is immense. The Ammonites hire a massive coalition, including 20,000 highly trained foot soldiers from Zobah, along with other Aramean troops. They are facing overwhelming odds.
This is a moment of existential crisis for Israel, and this is where it gets really interesting for the believer. When you are outnumbered, when the apparatus of the enemy looks terrifyingly effective, and the costs are immediate and severe, where does your faith land?
The enemy is literally pressing Israel on two fronts. And the narrative handles the fear by focusing not on the numbers, but on the covenantal confidence displayed by Joab, David's general, in his battlefield speech.
It's one of the great rally cries of the Old Testament. Joab tells the troops, "Be strong, and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight."
That last phrase is so crucial. The Lord will do what is good in his sight. It commands human courage and effort. Be strong and let us fight bravely. But it completely removes the pressure of ensuring the desired outcome from their hands.
Yes. It's an exercise in profound commitment to duty, but it's rooted in theological certainty. Their job is fidelity. God's job is sovereignty.
They fight bravely for their people.
But they stake the final result entirely on God's sovereign will. This kind of faith-filled declaration is what separates the covenant community from the surrounding nations.
And the result validates that approach. David personally leads the counterstroke, routing the huge coalition and decisively crippling the Aramean capacity to project force.
The conflict ends not with another war, but with a concise diplomatic statement that acts as Zobah's epitaph.
The Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore.
And that's the end of Zobah's military power.
A smooth ending. But history is rarely that clean. We have to trace the story into Solomon's reign, which is defined by incredible prosperity, but also
A slow, internal spiritual compromise. Zobah, as a distinct kingdom, dissolves. But the latent resistance does not.
And out of the ashes of Hadazer's defeat comes
Rezon, who had fled from Hadadezer, rises up to become a persistent adversary to Israel under Solomon. He's described as adding to the trouble caused by Hadad, the Edomite adversary.
Imagine being Rezon, a bitter, displaced general waiting patiently in the shadows of Damascus, watching the incredible wealth and internal drift of Solomon's kingdom.
He sees the decadent parties, the multiplying of horses and foreign wives.
And he knows that if Israel falters in its fidelity, Zobah's influence, the spirit of the northern opposition, can rise again.
Rezon's reemergence is a profound warning shot.
And what was the core weakness that allowed Rezon to succeed where Hadadezer had failed?
It was Solomon's drift. His kingdom, despite its wealth and power, it succumbed to syncretism and idolatry. It violated the very covenants that had secured their prosperity in the first place.
And the biblical writers are meticulous in framing this.
They are. They frame this resurgence of external pressure Rezon in the north, Hadad in the south, not as God's failure to protect David's line, but as covenantal warning and discipline.
So when the king and the people start trusting in their own apparatus, their wealth, their security, their alliances, rather than God,
God allows the old enemy, the very symbol of self-reliance, to return and apply pressure. That is the mechanism of covenantal discipline.
So God promised ultimate unconditional success for David's line.
But he reserved the right to use external pressure to correct current sin and recall his people to fidelity. This confirms that history, even when it's painful, is always covenantal. The Lord steers the storyline, using both decisive victory and persistent adversity to achieve his purpose.
Zoba's history is clearly so much more than just military history. It's a carefully crafted theological commentary.
It really is.
So let's move into this third section and explore why the biblical writer dedicated so much space to this kingdom's rise and fall.
Well, first, Zoba's opposition to David has to be viewed through the lens of the foundational promises. When this powerful Zoba coalition fights Israel, they activate the Abrahamic promise structure.
Whoever curses you, I will curse.
Exactly. This ensures that Zoba's defeat is not just geopolitical, it is a spiritual judgment.
And of course, the Davidic covenant provides the ultimate backbone for all of this.
It does. The unconditional guarantee of an eternal house, a throne, and a kingdom.
David's victories over Zoba, then, are tokens of God's absolute faithfulness to that promise.
They're historical outworkings, provisional realizations, you could say. They're proving in that specific moment that the Lord was with his anointed and would defend his design against the strongest regional opposition.
Even the immense wealth consecrated from Zoba was preparation for the temple.
The physical heart of the Davidic covenant. So these victories are a historical proof that the promises are operational.
As we interpret these ancient conflicts, I think a careful distinction is essential for our modern Christian audience. How do we apply the story of David's conquest without assuming the church should operate like some kind of geopolitical empire?
That's a critical point. We have to adhere to a grammatical historical approach and recognize the discontinuity in redemptive history.
So the church is not David's army.
Not at all. We did not inherit David's sword or Israel's territorial covenants. Those were physical, national promises.
We preach a spiritual kingdom that operates by different means.
Exactly. The church's mission is to proclaim Christ crucified and risen, the true, ultimate Son of David.
Who will one day sit upon that promised throne in Jerusalem.
Yes, and secure the final physical global peace. But until then, our weapons are spiritual, not geopolitical. The subjugation of Zoa is therefore an episode within Israel's specific redemptive historical arc.
It anticipates the future messianic kingdom.
Perfectly, where the Messiah reigns and all enemies are subdued. But it is not a direct operational pattern for the church's conduct today. We admire the victory as a testament to God's sovereignty, but we spread the gospel through proclamation, not conquest.
What's so fascinating here is how the source material links the victory with the subsequent discipline. The same sovereign God who granted David this stunning victory over Zoba
Also allowed the Aramean pressure, personified by Rezon, to return during Solomon's reign.
It's a complex relationship between success and suffering.
It is, and it helps us understand God's comprehensive governance. The biblical narrative affirms that principle from Proverbs. The Lord disciplines those he loves.
So Israel's story is not a straight line of constant triumph.
Not at all. It's a complex, covenant-driven tapestry where both mercy, like the victory over Zoba, and judgment, like Rezon's return, advance the overall program that culminates in Christ.
So the pressure that came under Solomon, this northern adversary exploiting Israel's drift, was not an accident of history.
No, it was a redemptive intervention.
A loving intervention.
It was a covenantal warning, designed to recall the king and the people to fidelity before their syncretism led to total, irreversible ruin. It demonstrates God's active commitment. He will not abandon his promise to David, but he will discipline the human agents, even the great King Solomon, when they fail to walk in obedience.
Let's revisit Zoba's most defining characteristic, their reliance on horses and chariots. This has to be the most enduring and applicable theological lesson of the whole narrative.
It absolutely is.
This contrast between human apparatus and covenantal faith.
It is. And the contrast is explicitly built into the narrative structure. As we noted, the law had already warned against multiplying horses. The temptation for every powerful nation, every successful organization, every successful individual is to transition from trusting the deliverer
to trusting the deliverance mechanism.
That's it, exactly. Meaning, once the system is established, the wealth, the influence, the defensive barriers, we start trusting the system itself, forgetting the source of the original provision.
That's the idol of apparatus.
That's it. For Zoba, it was the physical strength of their chariot corps and their extensive economic reach. For David, the hamstringing of the horses was his physical dramatic rejection of that universal temptation.
He ensured the nation knew salvation did not rest on chariot wheels.
You did. We need to see that Zoba's failure was ultimately a failure of misplaced confidence. They relied on their systems, their wealth, and their deities. David relied on the Lord, The collision between these two faiths proved decisively the superiority of covenantal dependence.
That sets the stage beautifully for the modern application. If Zoba represents the idol of apparatus, how do we see that idol manifesting in our own lives, professions, and faith communities today?
This is the most crucial part of our deep dive, taking the truth revealed in the fall of Zoba and making it practical for you today.
So let's start with the first one, reading history with faith.
The foundational spiritual lesson is learning to see history, both global and personal, not as a series of random, chaotic events, but as the active arena of God's providential faithfulness.
The chronicler kept hammering it home.
He did. He repeatedly asserted that the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Others might look at David's victories and attribute them to sheer luck, or political genius, or maybe the temporary weakness of Egypt and the Mesopotamian powers.
But the believer is called to trace providence where others see only chance.
And that's the call to worshipful realism. When we read the headlines today, the rise and fall of geopolitical powers, the aggressive plotting of various nations, the shifts in economic dominance, we must read them not with fear, but with Psalm 2 in view.
We're reminded that the Lord sits enthroned.
And he laughs at the arrogant plotting of nations that forget their limits. So the application here is this. Faith demands that we view history, whether it's the global history in the news or the personal history unfolding in our own lives, as the theater of God's faithfulness.
And this dramatically shifts our focus from panic over circumstances
To quiet confidence in the ultimate actor who is working all things toward the consummation of his plan in Christ.
That leads to the second application, trusting God over resources, obedience versus apparatus.
This is the practical warning that hits home hardest in our professional lives and in ministry. Today, Zoba's chariots don't look like metal and wood.
No, they look like budgets, brand platforms, market share, or massive follower counts.
It's the idol of modern apparatus. And it's not that prudent planning or sound financial management is wrong. We're called to be wise stewards.
Of course.
But idolatrous confidence in our resources is wrong. We transition from stewardship to idolatry when we believe success is guaranteed by the size and quality of our visible systems.
And you can think about the internal pressure within so many organizations or ministries today. Success is often defined purely by scalable metrics.
Right. How many people? How big is the building? How large is the endowment? When we fixate on those numbers, we are dangerously close to trusting in chariots and horses, subtly substituting our human means for God's indispensable power.
That puts the spotlight right back on David's painful choice to hamstring the horses. He chose obedience to a higher principle over maximizing his apparatus.
He did. So the application for us is this. The church's core calling remains simple and countercultural. Preach Christ with integrity and courage, focusing intensely on faithfulness, not on favorable metrics.
We have to trust that the Lord adds the increase and guards his work, regardless of unfavorable odds or whether our budget compares favorably to a competing organization.
Our focus is obedience. God provides the increase.
The third point is about the stewardship of success, humility.
We saw David's response to his victory over Zoba. He consecrated the immense plunder, the silver, the gold, the bronze to the Lord. He was not self-congratulatory. He was grateful, humble, and consecrating.
That provides a pattern for success in any area of life. I think many people can handle adversity, but true character is revealed in how we handle prosperity and victory.
It is. The temptation after a great success, a career promotion, a breakthrough in ministry, a significant financial gain, is to take the credit, to hoard the spoils, and to assume that the victory validates our own genius.
And David prevented this slide into pride.
He did by immediately dedicating the success back to its source. So the application is whenever God prospers us, grants us growth, or provides great stability in our family, ministry, or career, the response must immediately be gratitude, consecration, and transparent stewardship. We must not allow success to fuel arrogance.
It's so easy to do.
It is. The question that instantly levels pride and frees our generosity is that rhetorical question from 1 Corinthians, what do you have that you did not receive? All of our success, all of our talent, all of our resources are ultimately a gift. Acknowledging that truth prevents success from becoming a spiritual snare, just as David prevented Zoba's chariots and wealth from becoming a national idol.
Which brings us to the fourth lesson, the grace of discipline.
We have to return to the complexity of Solomon's reign and the return of that northern pressure in the form of Rezon. It serves as a stark reminder that yesterday's decisive victory does not guarantee tomorrow's ease.
This is one of the most pastorally critical points of the entire Zoba narrative.
I agree. It reveals a profound truth about the nature of God's love. David defeated the enemy. Solomon, through compromise, invited the enemy's spirit back into his kingdom.
So, if we see a persistent external pressure returning in our lives, a persistent adversary, a repeated struggle, a difficult financial period, how are we as covenant people supposed to interpret that?
We are called to interpret it, first and foremost, not as random bad luck, but through the lens of divine love. The application is this. When we drift, when our hearts wander towards self-reliance, moral compromise, or spiritual apathy, God may sovereignly allow pressure to return,
He does this not to destroy us.
but to recall us to covenant fidelity. This is the grace of discipline. The author of Hebrews reminds us that the Lord disciplines those he loves.
So the external adversity, the return of that Zobahite-related pressure, is a loving intervention.
Yes, designed to purify and strengthen the covenant people. The Lord wounds to heal, and he prunes to ensure we bear more fruit.
Finally, let's talk about believers and national destinies. Zoba's fate, this once mighty kingdom now dissolved and subservient, illustrates God's ultimate moral governance over all nations.
It places all national destinies within God's sovereign control. Zoba's rise and fall serve as a powerful object lesson for all political powers, past and present. They remind us that every nation, no matter its military might or economic dominance, has limits. It operates on borrowed time under the sovereign king.
So what does this mean for the believer today? What's the application?
We are called to participate actively in earthly life, to pray for our rulers, pursue peace, and seek the welfare of the city where we are placed.
But while we participate in the political process, we must always bear witness to the fact that our ultimate allegiance is to a kingdom not of this world.
That's the critical balance. Scripture never baptizes any earthly power or political system. It refuses to allow us to view our nation as perpetually righteous or invincible.
It reminds every earthly power, whether Zoba then or nations now,
That they stand ultimately under the supreme authority of the King of Kings. Their armies, their economies, and their apparatus are only permitted existence for as long as it serves God's unfolding purpose.
This has been a tremendously deep look at a relatively minor player in the Old Testament tapestry. But Zoba's importance, we now see, is profound.
It really is.
It's measured not by how long it endured, but by how brightly it reveals the core patterns of God's sovereign rule over history.
Indeed. We trace Zoba as the early potent threat under Saul, pressing Israel on every side.
We saw how its chariots and alliances met the unassailable will of the Lord under David, who granted victory and ensured the spoils of war were immediately dedicated to God's name.
And finally, we saw the shadow of Zoba return in Risen during Solomon's day, serving as painful but necessary proof that God would use pressure to purify and warn his people when their hearts drifted.
The ultimate lesson for us is not really about history, is it? It's about where we place our confidence. Earthly power and apparatus, the budgets, the platforms, the influence, they shine brightly and they fade quickly. But the covenant promises of God, anchored in Christ, stand firm forever. The outcome of history truly belongs to the one who gives salvation to kings.
And we return to that powerful summarizing statement that defined David's success and God's faithfulness throughout this entire arc. A verse that assures us that God is actively engaged in the affairs of the world. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went.
That's the promise.
May that be the encouragement for you today. God's sovereignty is not merely a philosophical concept. It is active, it is personal, and it is focused entirely on accomplishing his purposes through faithfulness. The victory of David over the mighty Zobahites assured you that if you walk in covenant fidelity, trusting not in your own resources or systems, but in the name of the Lord, he is with you.
Go forward this week with that deep assurance. May the God who sets up and removes kings give you the wisdom to know where your true strength lies and the courage to trust him fully in every victory and every challenge. Amen.